Hello, Professor Stevenson here with week two's wrap up. So, just a couple of housekeeping things. With your posts, what I'd like to see you do more of is to stick close to the primary text. The Bazell and Hertzberg and any of the outside readings, like this week we had Jarrett and Friedel, those provide a lot of context. But I want you to deal with more specifically in your posting the primary text. And most of you did a good job of that, but here's just my reminder to continue to do more of that. The other thing I want to mention to you is that if in any case, because we're not face-to-face and in person, if in these wrap-ups I butcher your name, please send me an email and correct me. This happens sometimes, and I do apologize, but I like to get it right. So in these wrap-ups, the first one's a little bit different than the second one, but what I like to do is I like to highlight strong answers so that if you had difficulty with the answers, you can look to the ones that I'm talking about as good examples, and then highlighting high points of discussion. So let's get started. So the first question, what is truth? You all had some really great answers on this. And I know at first a lot of you were like, what is truth? What? But I really want you to focus on like how this comes out in the text. It's a good exercise to think about, especially considering this is something that will continue to come up in the readings all semester. So the first time you get a question like this, you're like, what? But by the following weeks, when you get a pretty similar question, you'll be like, oh, well, here's how it was in this person, and here's how it is in this week. So I thought, first of all, that Elisa had a really great answer on this, and hopefully I'm pronouncing her name correctly. So she said, from the introduction of the Dosoi Logoi, Rosamund Kent Sprang summarizes the underlying theme of truth. This approach may seem to advocate for sort of situational ethics, which can in some case lead to cultural relativism. In other words, only an individual's perspective can determine the value of a given object, act, experience, and so on. So that's from kind of the introduction. In section 1 of the Dosoi Logoi, the author commences his explanation of truth by juxtaposing situations and arguing that they are both good and bad depending on the situational relativism. One of many examples is the following. An illness is bad for the sick, but good for the doctors, and death is bad for those who die, but good for the undertakers and the grave diggers. In relation to truth, the author further explains that it is all things are seemly when done at the right moment, but shameful when done at the wrong moment, which brings up a lot of the idea of kairos. So thinking about timeliness of action. She goes on to say, similarly, truth as described by the author is situationally relative. It is clear then that the same statement is false when the false is present to it, and true when true is present to it. According to this logic, anything can be both true and false depending upon the circumstances. So I think that really gets to the Dosoi Logoi brings in context in a way that really helps us think about that. Going on to think about how this operates in Isocrates, Morgan has a really great point. She states, Isocrates, in fact, cares so much that the audience clearly understands the truthfulness of his past speeches that he elaborates on them further. I want to plead briefly on behalf of each of them and make it even clearer that I spoke then and now continue to speak the truth about them. Isocrates believes that truth can act as persuasions when the words themselves are just. Azucena goes on to talk about Isocrates. For Isocrates, truth or knowledge or what will be is unattainable to humans. What humans can achieve is virtue and soundness of mind, but even these can only be truly developed if the student has an innate ability She says, I can see how this belief that truth is relative to human experience appeals to today's world because we are becoming more globalized, similar to an extent as what Athens was experiencing, and there's a need to foster tolerance, and one way to do that is by accepting that we see things differently. I think those are all really great. I think the thing to point out is that you see a split between kind of Gorgias, the author of the Dissologoi, and then Isocrates a little bit, because Isocrates, as much as he is connected to the Sophists, he is also more connected to the political world of Athens, and a lot of his conceptions about rhetoric and truth are connected to how they can shape the political world. And so I think that both Morgan and Azucena point out that there is wisdom in truth, that the words have to be just, and that there's a virtue in this idea. Kind of speaks to his rhetorical project a little bit more and how it relates to the political atmosphere of 5th century Athens. And then on the whole, I think you guys all really did really great at this question. You really grasped the idea that these thinkers are really thinking about truth as experience, cultural, and personal. So next question, what does rhetorical education look like to each of our authors? How is it useful? Michael has a good answer. He says, education, as far as our authors were concerned, would be useful in teaching persuasive skills to win arguments. For the author of the Dissologoi, education in wisdom and moral excellence should be reserved for those with natural talent and ability. This text lists the ability to speak correctly as a necessary skill for persuasion. Gorgias's defense of Helen is founded on the power of speech, specifically the addictive nature of persuasive speech. Gorgias would advocate that rhetorical education be used to influence the city to make good decisions as opposed to evil ones. He would present a paradox in the context of education with his argument. Nothing exists, or if it does exist, we cannot know it. Or if we can know it, we cannot communicate our knowledge to another person. So I think pointing out how Gorgias, because the encomium of Helen is such a showpiece, and because Gorgias's rhetorical prowess is known to be more hypnotic, we kind of see Gorgias as seeing an audience as a little bit more passive, in that rhetoric has a power to move in a way. So this is like the big speaker and the big audience, which is different, you all kind of point out, than how Isocrates sees rhetorical education. He's definitely got a larger project that he's thinking of here. And so Gorgias is trying to train really sort of passionate rhetors, whereas Isocrates is trying to think about statesmen. So Adrian talks about, has a great answer here. She says, Isocrates mentions subjects such as astrology and geometry, which he considers valuable for training the mind. But he does point out that students do not remember for very long because they do not have a bearing on our lives or help with our activities, but in every respect are non-essential. This is in contrast, she says, with rhetorical education and the thinking that skills come with it, which he credits for the practical success of his students, particularly the military success of Timotheus. Could anyone provide a clearer demonstration of his strategic thinking than this? And of course, she says, Isocrates claims that his teaching persuades students to be virtuous and undertake dangers on behalf of the city. So that's really important to point out. We'll see in, I think, Cicero and then Quintilian how this rhetorical education project becomes expanded to really humanistic education. But Isocrates' project is that we can teach wisdom, we can teach virtue, and we can teach technique. Now, he still thinks that virtue isn't exactly 100% teachable, so you have to have a good person. But on the whole, you can shape some people. Not everyone is destined to be an amazing rhetor, but especially in 5th century Athens, where the democracy is expanding and landed men are able to represent themselves in law courts and also in the assembly, right? So this skill, he thinks, is something, rhetorical education, having a project that can expand to more people, is a positive thing. And then the next question, what is the role of rhetoric in civil society? Morgan has a really great answer here. She says, after having been educated in the art of discourse, rhetoric can be used in a number of ways. In the Encomium of Helen, Gorgias reminds the audience of the power of discourse. Quote, which by the smallest, most secret body accomplishes the most divine works to produce a variety of emotions and sensations. Gorgias used this power to persuade a case for Helen's justice in history. In Antidosis, Isocrates uses this power to defend himself by calling on past speeches to act as evidence of his innocence. Interestingly, both of these examples show a methodological move to include past events to address present situations. The role of rhetoric is also important in systems of government because of how it can be used to govern people. In De Soi Logoi, the anonymous author reminds the audience of the power of public speaking performances and the importance of their correctness to help lead a community. Quote, the man who intends to speak correctly on whatever matter he speaks about must know how to give sound advice to the city on the performance of good actions and prevent them from performing evil ones. Morgan goes on to say that rhetoric not only acts as a means of defense or evidence, but it also as a necessity to govern communities through the soundness of speech. When observing good advice, communities can find themselves protected by good actions that come from it. By knowing the power of discourse and the potential to protect groups of people, public speakers have a responsibility to use the discourse they use to positively affect the community of the people they represent. So I think that's a really positive project that we see in the De Soi Logoi that we come to at the end. Candace also talks about the role of rhetoric. She says the role of rhetoric and what was valued seems to be service to the democratic state and the development of that through rhetorical education. For Gorgias, the power to present masterful speeches using words to get what you want. For Isocrates, the power to use rhetoric to mold a moral character, which is refined through the delivery of speeches, as he believed what you presented in speech was a reflection of the way you were as a person. As such, then, for both men, service to the state would be served through speech, a means of political participation. And then Madeline also had a great answer. I'll just read part of it. For civil society, Gorgias seems to emphasize the effect of rhetoric. Rhetoric has an emotions and humanity, talking about how just as different drugs draw off different humors of the body, and some put an end to disease and others to life, so too do discourses. Some pain, to others delight, others terrify, others rouse the hearers of courage. And so I think you guys all really thought about the way that you guys are all really able to think about the context of Athenian democracy and draw conclusions based on the texts that you had in front of you. A couple of other high parts of discussions. Discussing truth. I know that was a big one for you all, is thinking about, I think most of you all were comfortable with the idea that these authors thought of truth as relative. But for those that weren't, just know that the sophists really weren't complete relativists. They also they knew that they were culturally agreed on values, and so they were able to use knowing their audience and knowing the values represented by those audiences to capitalize on making good arguments. So this is where the concept of kairos comes in. This is where the concept of phronesis comes in. You guys had a good discussion of poetry as rhetorical, which not in the text that we're reading for Plato, but famously Plato kicks the poets out. But poetry and specific oral epic traditions had a really strong place in teaching Greek society. So we taught values through Homer's epics. So there really is a big value on that in terms of poetry. And then a couple of you had a really good discussion about philosophy versus rhetoric. This will definitely be heightened when we discuss Plato, because Isocrates doesn't see the value in philosophizing for what he thinks is no good reason. It has to be a way to think about action and political action, whereas you'll get Plato and Aristotle, kind of further from the political action, are able to go through dialectic and think about these things more philosophically, and they hold philosophy up further than rhetoric, whereas Isocrates sees rhetoric higher than philosophy, seeing the value of both, obviously. And so for further discussion, you guys all had good points as well, all over the place. Asusena asks about writers and about how these writers conceive of students. It's kind of going to be a big project of rhetoric to take on the subject of education. So it's really great that you all are educators, or not all of you, but most of you are educators here, because you'll pick up on that. Quintilian writes the kind of rhetorical education piece at the end of the semester. Kathleen saw that part about gymnastics in Isocrates. The Greeks were really into athletics, so wrestling, gymnastics, and they played a role sometimes in rhetoric. So there's a book called Bodily Arts written by Deborah Haughey that's super interesting, but it talked about how some rhetors, Demosthenes is famously has famously been reported as running up a hill with stones in his mouth to train his body to speak in a certain way. So that's kind of interesting. And then Ashley had a question about the decline of teaching rhetoric. So obviously in this seminar, you're getting a lot of rhetoric is really powerful. It becomes a tool of democracy. It helps lift people into different classes. It helps leaders make their case. At some point, the rhetorical texts that we read become lost, and then they get rediscovered in, I think, the Renaissance. But then the modern academy, so this is where there's the split between rhetoric and literature. The modern academy at some point takes up literature a little bit more, and then rhetoric kind of falls somewhere between communication departments and then English departments under the guise of, studying rhetoric, but also teaching composition. That might be changing now in the present, when the humanities are definitely under siege a little bit. There's sort of this debate on, is rhetoric more useful than literature? So that's got a long and sordid history that is even bigger than what I can present here. So anyway, you all are doing great. So that's a wrap on this wrap up. If anything wasn't clear or you have further questions, do me a favor and send me an email. Thank you.